There comes a moment in some people's lives where nothing works anymore. Not effort, not insight, not discipline, not willpower. You wake up knowing exactly what you should do, but your body does not respond. You sit in front of tasks you understand perfectly well, and yet something inside you simply shuts down. You are not panicking. You are not overwhelmed with emotion. You are not even particularly sad. You are just still, frozen. And that is often the most frightening part, because you are used to coping, used to pushing through, used to understanding yourself well enough to move forward. And now, none of that works anymore. From the outside, this state is deeply misunderstood. It gets called laziness, avoidance, lack of motivation, sometimes even depression. But from the inside, it feels very different. It feels as if your system has gone offline. You are present but distant, aware but unable to act, alive but disconnected from movement, desire, and direction. Carl Jung would never have described this as a defect of character. He would have seen it as a psychological emergency response, because the freeze state is not the absence of energy. It is what happens when the psyche has been forced to mobilize energy for too long, without rest, without integration, without meaning. For many people, freeze does not appear at the beginning of struggle. It appears after years of responsibility, after emotional overfunctioning, after carrying what was never consciously chosen. Very often, it appears after awakening, after insight, after seeing too much, after realizing that the life you were living no longer fits, but having no idea yet how to live differently. This is where the psyche reaches its limit, not dramatically and not explosively, but quietly. Anxiety gives way to numbness. Urgency gives way to heaviness. Fear gives way to an eerie stillness. And this stillness terrifies the ego, because the ego survives through movement, through doing, through direction. When movement disappears, the ego believes something has gone terribly wrong. But Jung understood something our culture often forgets. When the psyche cannot move forward safely, it stops. Not to punish you, not to sabotage you, but to protect you from further fragmentation. The freeze state is not collapse. It is containment. A forced pause imposed by the unconscious when conscious adaptation has gone too far. This is why freeze so often follows periods of intense inner work, prolonged stress, or chronic self-betrayal. You did not suddenly become incapable. Your system decided that continuing the old way would cost you something essential, and so it pulled the brakes. In this state, people often say they don't feel like themselves anymore, that they know what they want in theory but can't access it, that they're not sad but empty, that they feel stuck without knowing why. What makes this state especially confusing is that it does not feel like a crisis. There is no clear enemy to fight, no obvious emotion to process, no dramatic breakdown. Just a quiet refusal inside the body. And because our culture equates healing with action, this refusal gets interpreted as failure. But from a Jungian perspective, freeze is not the psyche giving up. It is the psyche reorganizing itself beneath the level of conscious control. When the ego has carried too much for too long, the unconscious intervenes. It withdraws energy from the external world, reduces engagement, slows the system down to a near standstill. This is not pathology. It is a protective regression, not backward, but inward. And yet living inside this state is deeply unsettling, because you can no longer rely on who you used to be. The part of you that managed, planned, anticipated, and endured has gone silent, and without that part, you feel exposed, lost, as if the ground beneath your identity has disappeared. This is why so many people try to force themselves out of freeze. They push harder, shame themselves, search for the right insight, the right explanation, the right technique. But the freeze state does not respond to force, because force is exactly what brought you here. What is frozen is not your potential. What is frozen is the survival pattern that kept you functional at the cost of yourself. And until that pattern is understood, not intellectually but somatically and symbolically, the psyche will not release the pause. Freeze is not asking you to do more. It is asking you to stop abandoning yourself. It is asking for safety, not productivity. It is asking for honesty, not performance. And this is why it feels so threatening. Because it dismantles the identity that survived by overriding inner signals. It removes the illusion that you can think your way out of everything. It places you in a space where listening matters more than acting, where being matters more than becoming, where movement can only return if it arises from consent rather than pressure. And this is the part no one warns you about. That healing does not always look like progress. That growth does not always feel expansive. And that sometimes the most intelligent thing your psyche can do is stop. What makes the freeze state even more confusing is that it often appears at the very moment you thought you were finally healing. You have insight now. You understand your patterns. You can name your wounds. You see where you adapted, where you overgave, where you lost yourself. And yet, instead of feeling freer, you feel more stuck than ever. This is where many people begin to doubt the entire process. They wonder if awareness has made things worse, if opening their eyes somehow broke something that used to function. But what is actually happening is not regression. It is exposure. Before awakening, much of your energy went into adaptation, into doing what was necessary, into being who you needed to be in order to survive, belong, or be loved. That adaptation created movement. It created momentum. But it came at a cost. And awakening removes the anesthesia that once made that cost bearable. You can no longer unknow what you know. You can no longer override your body without consequences. You can no longer live against yourself and call it resilience. And so, when awareness arrives before a new way of living has formed, the system does the only intelligent thing it can do. It stops. This is why freeze is so often misdiagnosed as depression. On the surface, they can look similar. Low energy, withdrawal, loss of motivation. But internally, they are very different states. Depression collapses meaning. Freeze suspends it. Depression is often accompanied by hopelessness, by self-loathing, by the sense that nothing matters anymore. Freeze, on the other hand, is strangely neutral. You may not feel hopeful, but you don't feel completely hopeless either. You feel paused, as if something is being held back, not destroyed. As if life itself has stepped into a waiting position. From a Jungian perspective, this distinction is crucial. Jung understood that the psyche does not dismantle something unless it intends to rebuild it differently. Freeze is not emptiness. It is compression. Energy has not disappeared. It has withdrawn inward. And inward is where the most threatening truths often live. Truths about how much you have endured, about how long you have been strong, about how deeply tired you actually are, about how little room there has been for who you really are beneath your roles. This is why freeze feels so physical. It lives in the body before it makes sense in the mind, in the heaviness of the chest, in the tension of the neck and shoulders. in the gut that tightens at the thought of obligation, in the exhaustion that sleep does not resolve. Your body is not malfunctioning. It is communicating. And what it is saying is not subtle. It is saying that forward movement, as you knew it, is no longer safe. For many people in freeze, the most painful realization is that rest alone does not fix it. They try to slow down. They take time off. They remove pressure. And still, the numbness remains. This is because freeze is not just exhaustion. It is exhaustion plus meaning loss. The psyche did not stop because you were tired. It stopped because the direction you were moving in no longer aligned with your inner truth. And until that mismatch is acknowledged, energy will not return. This is also why forcing yourself to move again so often backfires. The moment you try to push, motivate, or discipline yourself out of freeze, the system tightens. Because what it hears is not encouragement, but danger. It hears the same old message: keep going, ignore the signals, override what you feel. And the psyche refuses, not out of defiance, but out of self-preservation. Jung believed that symptoms persist as long as their message is ignored. Freeze persists because it is guarding something that cannot yet be lived without consequences. Often, it is guarding the truth that your old life was built on obligation rather than choice, that your value became tied to usefulness, that your sense of self depended on being needed, capable, reliable. These identities work until they don't, and when they collapse, there is no immediate replacement. This is the most disorienting part of freeze. You are no longer who you were, but you are not yet who you are becoming. You cannot go back, and you cannot move forward. You are suspended between identities. Jung saw this as a necessary phase in individuation, a liminal space where the old ego organization dissolves, and a deeper center has not yet fully emerged. It feels empty, but it is not meaningless. It is transitional. And yet, living inside this transition requires a level of patience most people were never taught. It requires allowing life to be undecided. It requires letting go of timelines. It requires tolerating the anxiety of not knowing who you are without immediately filling the gap. This is why freeze feels unbearable to the ego, because the ego survives on definition, on identity, on direction, and freeze removes all three at once. But what it gives you, slowly and quietly, is honesty. Honesty about what you can no longer tolerate. Honesty about what drains you. Honesty about what you are forcing yourself to want. And this honesty is not conceptual. It is felt, somatic, immediate. You don't think your way into it. You sense it in your body. And once you sense it, you cannot unfeel it. This is where the thaw begins, not with action, but with recognition. With the moment you stop arguing with what your body already knows. With the moment you stop trying to return to who you were and allow yourself to stay with who you are right now. Nothing dramatic changes at first. You are still slow, still hesitant, still uncertain. But the relationship to the freeze shifts. And that shift is everything. At some point, often without you consciously deciding it, the freeze begins to loosen. Not because you did something right, and not because you finally figured it out, but because the psyche starts to feel that it is no longer being forced. This is important to understand, because freeze does not release in response to effort. It releases in response to safety. And safety is not something you create by pushing yourself forward, but by stopping the internal pressure to be somewhere else than where you are. The first signs of thaw are usually so subtle that people miss them. There is no surge of motivation, no sudden clarity, no rush of energy. Instead, there are small moments that almost don't register. A breath that goes a little deeper without you trying. A moment where your shoulders drop, just slightly. A quiet sense of relief when you cancel something and don't immediately replace it with guilt. These moments are easy to dismiss, but they matter because they signal that your nervous system is beginning to trust again. What often surprises people is that thaw does not feel good at first. As the freeze softens, emotions begin to return, but not in a neat or organized way. Grief comes back in fragments. Anger surfaces without a clear target. Longing appears without an object. Many people panic at this stage and assume they are getting worse. They say they preferred the numbness because at least it was quiet. But numbness was never peace. It was containment. And now, the psyche senses that there is enough stability to allow feeling again. Jung understood that healing does not mean eliminating pain, but expanding the ego's capacity to hold experience without fragmenting. This is exactly what happens as freeze thaws. You do not suddenly feel better, but you feel more present, less dissociated, less divided against yourself. The system is no longer using shutdown as its primary form of protection because it has learned that awareness is no longer dangerous. During this phase, people often notice a profound change in how they relate to effort. Things that once felt obligatory now feel impossible. Not because you are incapable, but because your body refuses to participate in self-betrayal. At the same time, small things that feel authentic begin to draw you in, not with excitement, but with a quiet sense of rightness. This is the psyche recalibrating motivation from pressure to resonance. This shift can feel deeply unsettling, especially for people whose identity was built around being productive, reliable, or strong. They worry that if they don't push themselves, nothing will ever happen again. But Jung would say that what is returning now is not drive, but direction. And direction does not come from force. It comes from alignment. You may notice that your world becomes smaller for a while. You simplify. You reduce. You choose less. From the outside, this can look like stagnation. But internally, something very precise is happening. Your system is learning to distinguish between what drains you and what nourishes you, between what you tolerated and what you actually want. This discernment was impossible before freeze because survival required compromise. Now, compromise feels intolerable. As this process continues, a new sense of self begins to form. But it does not announce itself clearly. You don't suddenly know who you are. Instead, you know who you are not. You know what you can no longer do, what you can no longer give, what you can no longer pretend. This negative clarity is not a lack. It is a foundation. Jung believed that individuation often begins with subtraction rather than addition, with stripping away what is false before something true can take shape. This is also why people in thaw often feel more alone before they feel more connected. Old ways of relating no longer work. You cannot bond through overgiving, rescuing, or disappearing into the needs of others. And until new ways of connection emerge, there is a period of solitude. Not isolation, but separation. A necessary distance from roles that once defined you. What slowly replaces freeze is not ambition, but consent. You begin to act when something inside you agrees, even if that agreement is faint and fragile. You stop acting when it doesn't, even if your mind argues. This is a radical shift for people who lived most of their lives overriding inner signals, and it takes time to trust it. There will be moments when you doubt this process, moments when you fear that you are becoming passive or disengaged from life. But if you look closely, you will notice that what is disengaging is not life itself, but the parts of life that required you to disappear. What remains may feel quieter, smaller, less impressive, but it is real, and reality, once felt, is difficult to abandon. This is how freeze truly ends, not with a return to who you were, but with the emergence of a different orientation to living, one that moves more slowly, listens more carefully, and refuses to sacrifice the body for the sake of appearances. Jung would say that at this point, life is no longer organized around the ego's demands, but around the self. And the self does not rush. If you are in this phase of thaw, where you feel both lighter and more grounded, more present and more disconnected, it is important to understand that this is not the end of the process. It is simply a new beginning, one that unfolds slowly, without the rush of productivity, without the need for immediate answers. The thawing of freeze is not a return to the old, but the emergence of something more authentic. As your system continues to recalibrate, there will still be moments when you feel lost. The path will not always be clear, and there will be times when you doubt yourself. You may wonder if you'll ever be able to move forward again, if you'll ever feel truly alive. But remember this: thawing is not about arriving at a perfect version of yourself. It is about learning to live more honestly, more gently, and more in alignment with what you actually feel, not what you think you should feel. This process, while painful and confusing, is a profound act of self-respect. It is your psyche refusing to continue the old patterns that caused you to shut down in the first place. And while this may feel like a loss, like giving up on who you were, it is actually the beginning of something more expansive, more grounded, and ultimately more sustainable. In the early stages of thaw, you may find yourself in a space of limbo, where you are no longer who you were, but you are not yet who you are becoming. This space can be disorienting, but it is also full of potential. It is the space where you are finally free to choose what really matters, where you are no longer bound by external expectations, and where you are no longer trapped in the survival mode that once defined you. And when you start to emerge from this limbo, you will notice something very subtle. You begin to move differently, not with the urgency to prove yourself, not with the drive to achieve, but with a quiet sense of direction. The movement is slower, more deliberate. You no longer rush. You no longer fight against yourself. And this movement, though quieter, is rooted in something much more powerful than you have experienced before: self-trust. Trust that the thaw, although slow, is bringing you back into alignment with yourself. Trust that this space of waiting, of not knowing, is necessary. Trust that as you shed the old layers of who you thought you had to be, you are creating room for a more authentic expression of who you really are. This is the essence of individuation, the process Jung spoke of so often. It is not a goal to be reached or a state of perfection. It is a journey of becoming more whole, more integrated, and more real. It is the ongoing work of aligning your inner and outer worlds, of bringing your unconscious into conscious awareness, of embodying the truth of who you are in every aspect of your life. And so, if you are in this place of thaw, Know that it is not a final destination. It is the beginning of a deeper relationship with yourself. You are not broken. You are not failing. You are unfolding. And while this unfolding may not be linear, it is yours. It is real. If you resonate with this journey, if you find yourself in a space where you are letting go of old ways of being, where you are learning to move with greater honesty and integrity, I invite you to stay connected, to subscribe to this channel, to explore more about Jungian psychology, about the journey of individuation, and about how we can all begin to live more authentically. You don't need to rush this process. It is happening in its own time, at its own pace. And if you find that this video spoke to you, if you feel like you are beginning to thaw, beginning to trust again, take a moment to honor that. Take a moment to recognize how far you've come and how much more there is to discover. The journey is long, but it is yours, and it is unfolding beautifully. Thank you for being here. Take your time and trust the process.